Caleb Dawson's fist came down on Eliza Whitmore's kitchen table, so hard the coffee cups rattled against their saucers. "You think this is a game?" he said, his voice low and tight, the kind of low that meant he was holding something back, something ugly. He spread a document across the table, fingers pressing flat against the paper, like he was pinning something alive. "Sign it. Sign it, and I'll make sure Nathan Crowe loses that north pasture quietly. No scene. No court. He just disappears from the deed, and nobody has to know what kind of arrangement you two to have been running out there." Eliza didn't move. She stood at the far end of the table, with flour still on her hands from the bread she'd been making, and she looked at Caleb Dawson, at his clean shirt, and his banker's jaw, and his eyes that had never once held an ounce of doubt, and she felt something cold settle into her chest. Not fear. She'd felt fear before, and it didn't feel like this. This felt like the moment before a decision you can never take back. "You come into my house," she said quietly, "and you put that on my table. Come into your house," Caleb said, "and I offer you a way out before things get worse." She didn't sign. And that was the day Eliza Whitmore understood that surviving on the frontier wasn't only about weather and cattle and broken fences. Sometimes the most dangerous storm had a clean shave and a property deed in his hand. If you've ever watched someone you respect be pushed against a wall and told to disappear quietly, if you've ever stood in a room where the air itself felt like a threat, then you already know something about what this story costs. Stay with us through every part of this. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single moment, because the stories we tell here don't let go easy. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The winter Eliza Whitmore turned 28. She had already buried her father, negotiated 2 cattle contracts without a man beside her at the table, and repaired the south-facing fence line 3 times after it kept collapsing in the freeze-thaw cycle that plagued the lower elevation of their property. She did not consider any of this remarkable. She considered it Tuesday. The Whitmore Ranch sat on the western edge of the Bitterroot Valley in Montana, in a place where the mountains didn't so much surround you as tolerate you, where the land made clear, every single season, that your presence was conditional. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, had understood that. He'd built the ranch with a stubbornness that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with the simple refusal to be beaten by cold ground. When he died of a heart that gave out too soon, he left Eliza the land, 11 head of cattle that were more headache than asset, a tool shed full of equipment in varying states of disrepair, and no instructions whatsoever because he had never imagined she would need them. She needed them. The first year alone was the kind of year that either finishes a person or reveals what was already there. Eliza's nearest neighbor to the east, a widow named Clara Potts, watched with polite concern from a distance and occasionally left things. On the Whitmore porch, a jar of preserved beans, a note about which farrier in town was honest. Once a wool blanket she claimed she had too many of. Eliza took the blanket. She left the concern where it sat. She didn't have the luxury of falling apart. There were cattle to feed, fences to check, ice to break on the water troughs every morning, at a temperature that made her fingers stop functioning properly by the time she was halfway done. She learned to do things badly before she learned to do them right. She learned that competence wasn't something you arrived at, it was something you rebuilt every morning before the light came up. By the second year, she had expanded the herd to 30. By the third, she had a working relationship with 2 trading posts and a seasonal arrangement with a cattle buyer out of Missoula who respected a firm handshake and despised small talk. She never told him she was operating without a husband, a father, or any male relative who might give someone like him pause. Figured it out eventually, and to his credit, he adjusted his assumptions faster than most men did. The town of Harlan, 3 miles southeast, had formed its own opinion of her before she'd bothered to form one of them. She was called capable, which was a word the town used for women who made men feel slightly uncomfortable. She was called proud, which was what people said when they meant you didn't ask for help often enough to make them feel useful, called peculiar, which was the word reserved for a woman who lived alone by choice and didn't seem to be suffering from it. None of it kept her up at night. What kept her up at night in those early years was the constant arithmetic of survival: feed costs against beef prices, repair time against working hours, what could wait and what absolutely could not. Her father had kept these calculations in his head, and she had inherited neither his specific knowledge nor any written record of it. So she built her own system from scratch, a ledger that she kept updated with a regularity that would have impressed an accountant, except it was kept in pencil because ink froze in the winter. Nathan Crowe she had known by reputations before she knew him as a person. Most people in the valley did, talked about the way old mountains are talked about as something fixed and permanent and slightly forbidden, something that had been there longer than living memory and was expected to remain long after everyone discussing it was gone. He'd built the Crow Ranch on the northern slope of the valley over 30 years of work, so steady and so relentless that it had stopped looking like work and started looking like geology. He had cattle, land, a reputation for fair dealing that had survived more than one attempt to compromise it, and a silence around him that people interpreted differently depending on what they needed to believe. His wife, Margaret, had died 6 years before Eliza took over the Whitmore property. Town mourned Margaret Crowe with the particular enthusiasm reserved for people everyone had liked and nobody had bothered to truly know. Nathan received their condolences, yes, with the politeness of a man who understood that grief was not something you explained to people who were trying to help. He ran the ranch differently after she was gone. Not worse, possibly better, in measurable ways, but with a certain mechanical quality, as though he had made a decision to operate at reduced capacity, and was keeping that decision carefully maintained. He hired good people, paid them well, kept the books clean. He was at every cattle auction, every county meeting, every occasion that required the presence of a property owner who took his responsibilities seriously. He showed up. He simply stopped staying. Eliza first spoke to him directly in the autumn of her second year on the Whitmore property, when one of her fence posts had come loose during a windstorm, and 3 of her cattle had wandered onto the boundary edge of Crow land before she caught them. She drove out herself to explain and found him already aware of the situation, already matter-of-fact about it, already helping her ranch hand move the cattle back before she'd had the chance to apologize. "Post needs a different anchor," he said, not looking at her. "That soil on your south boundary drains fast. Standard post doesn't hold after 3 or 4 hard winters. You want something that goes down another foot at least." She looked at him. "Is that offered or sold?" He looked at her then, just briefly. "Offered." She nodded. "Then I'll take it." He sent one of his men over the following week with the right equipment. She paid for the labor herself because she preferred the transaction clean. He didn't make a point of it. That was the beginning of whatever it was they had between them, not friendship. Not exactly, but a kind of professional recognition. A mutual understanding that they were both trying to do the same difficult thing in the same difficult place, and that certain conversations could happen without preamble. She started crossing the valley that winter. It began practically. The shortest route between her property and the main trading post ran along the northern track past the Crow Ranch, and in deep winter the detour around it added significant time to an already miserable journey. Nathan had told her, in passing, that the track through his land was usable for any neighbor who needed it. She used it, and occasionally if she saw something on his property that looked wrong, a gate left open, a section of roof weighed down by ice past the point that seemed safe, she stopped and said something. He did the same for her. It was a functional arrangement, kind of thing 2 people with adjoining properties and no interest in drama will sometimes fall into without deciding to. But the valley was small, and people were watchful, and what the town saw was an unmarried young woman crossing an old widower's land in winter, and they built stories out of that, because stories were cheaper to maintain than mines. She ignored the stories for the same reason. She ignored most things that wasted time. The winter she turned 28, she crossed the valley. She crossed the valley in weather that had been threatening for 3 days to turn genuinely dangerous, the kind of cold where the air had a texture to it, where you could feel it pressing against the back of your throat when you breathed. She had supplies for Nathan's ranch, because his usual delivery from town had been delayed by the weather, and because his youngest ranch hand, a boy named Cody, who was too proud to admit when something was beyond him, had made a calculation error with the feed stores that Nathan hadn't caught yet. She knew about the feed stores because Cody had mentioned it to her in passing, in the way young men sometimes confess things to women they don't quite see as authority figures. And she had done the math and understood immediately what it meant. She did not call it helping. She called it logistics. Nathan met her at the gate with an expression that was somewhere between grateful and irritated, which he had come to understand was his default response to any situation he hadn't managed to handle himself first. "You didn't have to make the crossing in this," he said, taking one end of the supply crate before she could argue. "I know," she said. Cody's 22, she said. He made an arithmetic error. "It happens," Nathan grunted. That was a thing he did, a sound that meant he had an opinion he'd decided wasn't worth the breath. They got the supplies into the barn. He checked the numbers himself, which she expected, and his expression when he confirmed she was right was the expression of a man confronting something he would have preferred to find differently arranged. Not at the supplies. At the fact that she'd seen it before he had. "I'll put coffee on," he said finally. She sat at his kitchen table and drank bad coffee. It was always bad. He boiled it too long. She had never corrected him because it felt like a line she didn't need to cross. And they talked through the winter logistics the way they always did. Practical things. Supply lines, weather patterns, what she'd heard at the trading post about prices. He talked more than most people assumed he did, in the right company, in the right context. He had opinions about everything and the rare self-discipline to keep most of them to himself until they were asked for. He was not sure when she had started asking for them, but she had. At some point he got up to refill the cup's more bad coffee. She accepted it, and he came back with a plate of something she didn't immediately recognize. "What is that?" she said. "Pie," he said, with an offense in his voice that suggested this should have been obvious. "You bake. My daughter sent the recipe. I followed it. Whether that constitutes baking is a philosophical question I'm not going to get into." She looked at the pie. It was imperfect in a way that suggested genuine effort, crust uneven at the edges, the filling slightly too deep on one side. She tasted it. It was good. Not elegant, but good. Kind of good that came from doing something carefully rather than skillfully. He was watching her with an expression she could only describe as braced, which she found unexpectedly endearing in a man who negotiated cattle contracts without blinking. "Good," she said. He sat down. Something in him settled slightly. "There's more if you want it." "I want it." He gave her more. They sat with the wind picking up outside, pressing against the walls of the house in irregular gusts. And Nathan laughed at something she'd made a dry comment about the county assessor who had shown up to her property in September with the general attitude of a man who expected to be impressed by nothing, and the laugh was sudden and unguarded, kind of laugh that happens before a person can decide whether to allow it. She looked at him. He was 60 years old, or close to it. Kind of age that settles into a person differently, depending on what they've carried. She'd seen men his age who looked finished, and men his age who looked like they'd arrived somewhere. Finally, Nathan looked like the second kind, though she suspected he would have rejected that description with genuine discomfort. He caught her looking, and misread it, or chose to. "If I were 20 years younger," he said, with the self-deprecating lightness of a man is retreating to safer ground, "I might ask you to stay forever." He gestured, vaguely, at the kitchen, the pie, the situation. "Seems like you improved the place." He meant it as a joke. He was using the joke to say something he didn't know. He was saying, the way people sometimes do, the way honesty sometimes smuggles itself into a laugh. She looked at him for a moment. 20 years wouldn't change what I already know about you, she said. The wind pushed against the house. Nathan Crowe went very still. She hadn't planned to say it. She'd meant to let the joke land and move on, the way she usually did, the way it was easier to do. The words had come out before the practical part of her brain could intervene, and they sat on the table between them now, impossible to call back. He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before, not the grateful irritated, not the braced, not the carefully neutral face he used in public. This was something undefended, something that didn't quite know what to do with itself. "Eliza," he said, and then stopped. She stood up, started pulling on her coat because the alternative was sitting there, while both of them tried to figure out what had just happened. And she was not ready for that conversation yet. She might not be ready for it for some time. "The weather's going to hold another few hours," she said, her voice steady, for the steadiness costing something. "I should get back before it turns." He walked her to the door. He didn't say anything else. There was nothing to say that would have made the moment smaller or larger than it already was. But when she stepped out into the cold, he stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. She didn't look back. She crossed the valley with the wind at her back and the last pale light bleeding out of the western sky. And she thought about 20 years, what they meant, what they didn't mean, what a person built in 20 years and what they didn't and couldn't and wouldn't. She thought about the pie. She thought about the laugh. She thought about expression on his face when she'd said it. By the time she reached her own gate, she understood one thing clearly. Something had shifted. She didn't know yet whether it would hold weight. She didn't know yet whether it was the beginning of something, or the kind of moment that you look back on later and recognize as a turning point only because of everything that comes after. But she knew it had happened, and she knew that Caleb Dawson, who had been watching from the edge of town with the patient attention of a man who considered everything in the valley, his eventual business, she knew he had seen it too, heard about it, or was in the process of arranging to know, which was how he operated. She latched the gate. Inside, she sat at her own table with her own ledger and tried to do the evening numbers, and the numbers wouldn't come. The arithmetic that usually settled her mind, the way it usually settled, was refusing to cooperate. Closed the ledger. She sat in the dark for a while, listening to the wind, thinking about a man who baked bad pie with careful effort and laughed like someone who'd forgotten how and was surprised to remember. She thought about what Caleb Dawson would do when he realized she wasn't going to be managed. And she thought, whatever is coming, let it come. The morning after Eliza crossed the frozen valley, Harlan started talking. She knew it before she reached the trading post. She knew it from the way conversation adjusted when she walked through the door, not stopped, not exactly, but recalibrated the way a room sounds different when someone is suddenly aware of being heard. Meredith Hale, who ran the dry goods counter and had an extraordinary talent for knowing things before they happened, gave her a look that was approximately 40% sympathy and 60% fascination. "Cold crossing last night," Meredith said. "Not a question." "Always is," Eliza said. "Heard you were at Crote's place a good while." "I brought supplies." His delivery was delayed. She set her list on the counter. "I need 16 pounds of salt, 2 of the heavier rope coils, and whatever flour you have that isn't already spoken for." Meredith wrote it down without pushing further, which was as much as Eliza could hope for. Problem wasn't Meredith, who was essentially decent beneath the curiosity. Problem was the 3 other people in the trading post who had also heard the exchange, and who would be somewhere else entirely by afternoon, carrying the conversation with them. That was how Harlan worked. Not maliciously most of the time, just relentlessly. By the end of that week, the version of events that had settled into general circulation was this. Eliza Whitmore had been spending time at Nathan Crowe's ranch in a way that suggested something other than neighborly logistics. The specifics varied depending on who was telling it. Some versions were merely speculative. A few were unkind in the specific way that unkindness operates when it disguises itself as concern. She heard the concern version from Clara Potts, who appeared at her gate on a Thursday afternoon, with an expression of carefully arranged worry. "People are saying things," Clara said, once they were inside, and she'd accepted the tea that Eliza offered partly out of politeness and partly to give her hands something to do. "I want you to hear it from someone who means well." "Appreciate the distinction," Eliza said. Clara looked at her over the rim of the cup. "He's 30 years older than you, Eliza." 32. That's not, Clara paused. "That's not something I'd say with that tone if I were you." "What tone would you prefer?" "I'd prefer," Clara said carefully, "that you think about what you're doing before the whole valley has decided what it means." Eliza sat with that for a moment. She had, in fact, been thinking about it. She'd been thinking about it with considerable energy since the night she'd said something she hadn't planned to say in a kitchen that smelled like coffee, boiled too long, and imperfect pie. She had not arrived at any conclusion she was prepared to share with Clara Potts on a Thursday afternoon. "I'll take it under consideration," she said. Clara left unconvinced but out of reasonable arguments, which was the best available outcome. Eliza stood at the window and watched her go and tried to identify exactly what she was feeling. It was not embarrassment. She was reasonably confident of that. It was something more like the feeling of standing at the edge of something and not being able to see the bottom clearly, which was a feeling she didn't particularly like but had enough experience with to recognize as survivable. Practical reality was this: nothing had actually happened. She had said something honest. He had gone still. She had left. That was the sum total of events. The gap between that and what the town was already constructing around it was enormous, and she was being asked to feel things about a story that was largely invented. What she refused to do was retreat. She crossed the valley again the following week. For an entirely legitimate reason, the north-facing water system that served the boundary between their properties had an ice blockage that she'd spotted from her sunsuit, and that caused problems for both of them if left untended. She brought the tools she needed, and she sent no advance word because it was a practical matter that didn't require announcement. Nathan was in the upper pasture when she arrived. She heard him before she saw him. He was talking to his foreman, a leathery man named Hitch, who had been with the Crowe Ranch for 20 years, and who regarded the world with the specific exhaustion of someone who has seen all of it before and found it largely consistent with expectations. By the time Eliza had tied her horse and located the blockage, Nathan had come down. He stood a few feet away and looked at the ice formation she was already working at with a metal bar. His expression was the normal one, the practical one, which was either a relief or a disappointment, and she chose not to decide which. "I would have gotten to this," he said. "I know. I was here now." He picked up the second bar from where she'd set it down and worked the other side of the blockage without further commentary. They did this for 20 minutes in the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable exactly, but is extremely aware of itself. The ice cracked and shifted. The water started moving again in the channel beneath. "You hear what they're saying in town," he said. Not quite a question. "Yes." He drove the bar into the ice again, unnecessarily hard. "Fools." "Yes, I want you to know," he said, and then stopped. He looked at the channel. He looked at the bar in his hands. He was a man who was constitutionally better at doing things than saying them, and she could see him struggling with the gap between the two. "I don't want you to be in a position where, because of something I said, people are." "You didn't say anything," she said. "I said something." "I know what you said." The water ran freely now, dark and quick below the broken ice. She straightened and looked at him, directly, because she had found in general that directness was less complicated than its alternatives. "Are you about to tell me you don't want me crossing your land anymore?" she asked. "No." "Are you about to tell me to reconsider something?" "No." He said it with something that sounded almost irritable. "I'm trying to tell you that I'm aware of the situation, and I don't want it to cost you anything." She looked at him for a long moment. "Cost me what exactly?" He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. "Nathan." She said his name with more patience than she felt, because she recognized what was happening, and she had a low tolerance for watching capable people perform unnecessary self-sacrifice. I've been managing my own costs for 6 years. If you're concerned about my accounting, I can show you the ledger." Something flickered across his face. It might have been the beginnings of something that would have become a smile under different conditions. "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." She picked up her tools. "I'll check the other channel further east before I head back. If it looks blocked, you'll want hitch on it before the weekend." She left him standing by the water channel with an expression she didn't examine too carefully because she had a long ride back, and she needed to not be thinking about his face. The other channel was clear. She went home. Caleb Dawson made his first move 11 days after the night with the pie. She knew it was a move because Caleb Dawson didn't do anything that wasn't a move. He was 29 years old, and he had arrived in Harlan 3 years ago with capital that he deployed the way a general deploys a strategy methodically, with attention to terrain. He'd bought the old mill property east of town, converted it into a trading concern that undercut the established posts just enough to create dependency without destroying competition entirely, and had spent the intervening time acquiring influence the way some men acquire land, steadily, without fanfare, so that by the time anyone looked up and took stock, it was already done. He was not a bad-looking man. He had the kind of face that photographed well and was easy to trust on first meeting, which was a significant advantage in a town that still made most of its decisions on first meetings. He was charming in the functional way he remembered names. He asked the right questions. He laughed at the right moments. Eliza had never doubted that he was intelligent. She had doubted from fairly early on that intelligence was the thing he was most interested in using. Came to her property on a Tuesday morning in a wagon that was slightly nicer than the occasion required, which told her something about how he'd decided to frame the visit. "Miss Whitmore," he said, climbing down with the easy confidence of a man who had never once talked himself out of a room. "Hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "You are," she said, because she was halfway through restringing the gate mechanism, and the afternoon was not long enough for it to be a good time. "But come in anyway." He came in. He accepted coffee. She gave him the good kind, because she was not going to be ungracious in her own house. But she did not give him pie because there wasn't any, and because the comparison was not one she wanted sitting in the room. He sat at her table with a particular quality of ease that she recognized as practiced. He talked about weather, about supply prices, about the road conditions east of town that were making everything slower than it needed to be. She waited. "I wanted to talk to you about the Crowe property," he said finally, and there it was. She set her coffee down. "What about it?" "The north pasture." He said it easily, like it was a neutral topic that had simply come up. "Parcel along the upper ridge. I've been in conversations with some parties who are interested in that land. For grazing access, it connects to the valley route. North, you see, and for anyone trying to move significant cattle through the corridor, access to that pasture is worth paused, for the right word, considerable. Nathan Crowe's north pasture isn't for sale. Not officially. Not yet." He looked at her with the steady consideration of a man used to people who didn't immediately understand what he was actually saying. But Nathan's situation changes when the season turns. He's carrying more debt than people realize. I have that from the county records, which are public and available to anyone who looks. His margins are compressed. He's going to need to make decisions. Eliza looked at him for a moment. "And you want me to do what, exactly?" "I want you to think about your own position," Caleb said. He said it gently, which was the part that made it threatening. "You're carrying the Whitmore operation alone. You've done remarkably well. Genuinely, nobody in this valley questions your competence. But the scale you're working at has a ceiling, and you know that. If you were aligned with a larger operation." He didn't finish the sentence, just let it suggest itself. "Aligned," she said. "Partnered, practically speaking." She understood the geometry of what he was offering. Not love, not even respect. Exactly. Those were background elements. Scenic decoration around what was actually a business proposition, dressed in the language of something warmer. He was offering her security in exchange for steering her influence, her proximity to Nathan, her ability to be useful in a set of negotiations that required someone Nathan would actually open a door for. She thought about Nathan's face when he'd said 20 years. She thought about the way he'd driven the ice bar harder than necessary. "You should go," she said. Caleb looked at her as though he was deciding how surprised to be. He settled on mildly surprised, which was probably accurate. "I haven't. You've said what you came to say." She stood up. "I heard it. My answer is no. I'd like you to leave my property." He left. He was gracious about it. He was always gracious about things that hadn't worked yet, and she watched his wagon from the window until it was past the gate and onto the main track, and then she went back to the gate mechanism and the afternoon that still needed attending to. But her hands weren't steady the way they usually were. It took her longer than it should have to notice that, and longer still to understand why. It wasn't fear of Caleb Dawson, exactly. She'd handled difficult men before, and she was under no illusions about her ability to continue doing so. It was the information he'd carried. Nathan's debt, the North pasture, the compressed margins that Caleb had described with the particular confidence of a man who'd checked his numbers twice. She had not known. She thought back over every practical conversation she'd had with Nathan, the logistics, the supply chains, the weather calculations, and she realized that he had never once mentioned financial pressure. Not once. He had been careful about it, the way he was careful about other things he considered private, which was to say absolutely. She finished the gate mechanism. She fed the cattle. She made her evening entries in the ledger and then sat for a while looking at the fire. She was going to have to decide how much of what she knew she was going to pretend she didn't know, and for how long, and to what end. That was a different kind of arithmetic from the kind she was good at. The town's opinion arrived in stages, the way bad weather does. First came the looks, which she was accustomed to. Then came the direct comments, which she was less accustomed to, but had enough stubbornness to absorb. The direct comments came mostly from people she knew slightly, the kind of acquaintance that had just enough familiarity to feel entitled to an opinion, but not enough actual knowledge to make it worth anything. A woman named Patricia Soames, who ran the millinery and who Eliza had always found faintly exhausting, cornered her outside the post office one morning with the energy of someone who had been saving something up. "I'm going to say this as a friend," Patricia began, which was a sentence Eliza had learned to distrust categorically. "I'd prefer if you said it quickly," Eliza said. Patricia blinked. "Excuse me. I have a delivery to collect, and the post office closes early on Thursdays." Patricia gathered herself. "Nathan Crowe is a good man," she said, with the tone of someone conceding a point before making a larger one. "Nobody disputes that. But Eliza, he is almost 60 years old. He has a daughter your age. The life you'd be stepping into." "I'm not stepping into anything. I'm living in it. Same as always. People are going to talk. People are already talking. I haven't dissolved." Eliza stepped past her toward the post office door. "I appreciate the concern, Patricia. I really do." She collected her delivery. She walked to where her horse was tied and stood for a moment with her hand on the animal's neck, feeling the warmth of it, grounding herself in something reliable. The list of people who had opinions about her life was apparently longer than she'd calculated, and the opinions were more organized than she'd given them credit for. The thing that bothered her, the thing she turned over later, riding home was not the opinions themselves. She could survive opinions. What bothered her was the specific way they were framed, which was always about what she would be stepping into, as though her life was a series of transactions in which men were the primary asset, and she was the thing being moved around the board. She had not been a thing moved around a board for 6 years. She did not intend to start. The evening she decided to tell Nathan what she knew, she almost talked herself out of it twice. The first time was at the gate of her own property, where she paused for 10 minutes doing nothing useful while the horse stood with magnificent patience and the cold settled in around both of them. The argument for not telling him was straightforward. It wasn't her business. He hadn't told her. and inserting herself into his financial situation without invitation was exactly the kind of overreach she would have resented from anyone else. The argument for telling him was also straightforward. Caleb Dawson was using the information as a tool, and Nathan didn't know it was being used. And if the situation was as precarious as Caleb had described, then the time to have a conversation was before the options narrowed rather than after. She rode to his property. He was in the barn, which was where he often was in the evenings, not because there was always work, but because he was the kind of person who found thinking easier when his hands were doing something. She came in without ceremony and stood near the entrance while her eyes adjusted to the lamplight. "Caleb Dawson came to see me," she said. "He didn't look up from what he was doing." "I know," she waited. "He came to see me first," Nathan said. He set down the harness he was working on and turned to look at her. In the lamplight, he looked older than he did in daylight, or maybe just more, as he actually was the kind of tired that comes from carrying something specific for a long time and not telling anyone what it weighs. "He made me an offer on the north pasture 2 weeks ago." Declined. He apparently decided to try a different approach. "Through me. Through you." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, which was unusual. She had gotten reasonably good at reading him. "I should have told you he might. Why didn't you?" Picked up the harness again. "'Cause telling you would have meant explaining what he knows about the financial situation." He paused. "I wasn't ready to have that conversation." She sat down on a nearby hay bale without being invited, which was a liberty she'd been taking for about 2 years now, and that he had never objected to. Of it now. He looked at her sharply. Then, after a moment, he exhaled through his nose, the grunt that wasn't quite a grunt, and he sat down too, on a crate across from her, and he told her. The north pasture was, as Caleb had described, connected to a debt obligation Nathan had taken on 3 years ago, a decision made in a bad season when the margins were already thin, and the alternative had seemed worse. The original arrangement had been sound. The terms had shifted when the lender had sold the obligation to a new party, a company out of Billings that Eliza had never heard of but whose name she was going to remember, and the new terms were less manageable. Not catastrophic yet. Getting there. He told her this with the measured, flat voice of a man reading a document he disliked, and she a document he didn't. She listened with the attentiveness she gave to anything that involved numbers, and when he was finished, she sat with it for a moment. "What's the timeline?" she said. "End of the season puts me at a crossroads. If prices hold, I manage. If they drop another 5%, I'm looking at decisions." He looked at the harness in his hands. Caleb Dawson knows this because someone at the county office has a loose relationship with discretion, and because Caleb makes it his business to know these things about people. He's been watching you. He watches everything. That's how he operates. Nathan set the harness down with finality. The offer on the north pasture would clear the obligation. It's a fair price. I'd rather lose the pasture than sell to him, which tells you something about the offer. "Don't sell him anything," she said. He looked at her. "It might come to don't sell him anything." She said it again, not louder, just more settled. "There are other options. If the margin is the problem, there are ways to work on margin that don't involve handing him a corridor through the valley. I'm not asking you to solve this. I know you're not asking." She stood up. "That's generally when I do my best work." He stared at her, thought for a moment that he was going to argue. He had the look of a man assembling an argument, and then something shifted in him, and the argument dissipated before it arrived. "You can't fix this for me," he said quietly. "No," she agreed, "but I can think alongside you. If you'll let me." The lamp flickered. Outside, the wind had picked up to the point where it was audible inside the barn, a low, sustained note against the timber. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. She'd learned, in the years of their odd and functional arrangement, that silence with Nathan Crowe was not the same as absence. He was thinking. He was doing the same arithmetic she did, checking things from different angles, looking for what he might have missed. "Boundary contract," he said finally. "The one between our properties. If we extended the shared grazing rights through the spring season, increases your usable acreage on paper, changes the valuation calculation. She'd been thinking the same thing. Hitch would need to coordinate with my foreman. It's manageable. It doesn't fix the underlying. No. But it buys time, and time is what we need until the seasonal prices come in. He looked at her with the expression she'd seen on the night of the bad coffee and the imperfect pie, the one she still couldn't entirely classify. Something open in it. Something that hadn't been there the first time she'd pushed past his gate to tell him about a loose fence post. "Why are you doing this?" he said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. She thought about the honest answer. There were several layers to the honest answer, and she wasn't ready to put all of them on the table. Not here. Not tonight. Not with the lamp flickering and the wind outside, and the particular fragility of this moment that was already carrying more weight than she'd intended to put on it. She chose the layer she could say. Because Caleb Dawson wants the corridor, and I don't want him to have it. She looked at Nathan steadily. And because you're the best neighbor I've had in 6 years of needing a good one, and I am not going to watch someone take your North Dawson, take your North pasture, because he did the arithmetic before you told me what the numbers were. He was very still. The way he'd been still in the kitchen. A different kind of, still not startled this time. Considering Eliza, he said, Don't what? Whatever you were about to say, about not wanting to be a burden, or not wanting to involve me in something that's yours to manage, don't say it. She pulled on her coat. I'm already involved. I've been involved since the fence post 3 years ago, and the bad coffee, she stopped herself. I'm involved. Accept it. And let's figure out what comes next. He didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, The coffee isn't bad. Paused at the barn door. Nathan, it is spectacularly bad. It's strong. They are not the same thing. She stepped out into the cold, and she heard him faintly, behind her make the sound that on another man, in different company, might have been an actual laugh. She rode home through the dark with the wind cutting across the open ground between the properties, and she thought about Caleb Dawson's wagon and his easy confidence and his knowledge of numbers he had no right to. Thought about the company out of Billings, whose name she was going to look into because she knew a clerk at the county records office who owed her a small favor, and because information, in her experience, was always worth the effort of obtaining. She thought about what Patricia Soames would say if she knew Eliza had spent the evening in Nathan Crowe's barn talking about debt obligations and grazing contracts. She thought it would probably confirm every suspicion Patricia had, and for completely the wrong reasons, and she found that despite everything faintly, genuinely funny. The next morning she wrote to the county records office. She wrote to her cattle buyer in Missoula. She pulled out her ledger and did the extended calculations for the shared grazing arrangement, and found that the numbers worked, not perfectly, but well enough to be worth the conversation with Hitch and her own foreman. Steady man named Garrett, who absorbed new information without drama and executed it without complaint. She did not tell anyone in Harlan what she was doing. She let them have their conversations and their concerned looks and their versions of a story that was mostly wrong. And she went about the business of building a counter-arrangement that Caleb Dawson would not see coming because he had made the error that capable men often made when they looked at Eliza Whitmore. He had seen the young woman managing a struggling ranch alone and concluded that her judgment was primarily emotional. He had not considered that she had been doing math in her head every day for 6 years, that she understood land values and seasonal margins and the specific leverage points in a debt obligation better than most men who'd been taught to think they were good at such things, and that she had been angry quietly, steadily angry, since the moment he'd set that document on her kitchen table and pressed his fingers flat against it like he was holding something down. She was still angry. She was using it the way she used everything else, as fuel, as attention, as the thing that kept the arithmetic sharp. By the end of that week, she had 3 pieces of information that changed the shape of what was happening. The company out of Billings that held Nathan's debt obligation had a directorship that traced back through two intermediary arrangements to a holding account connected to Caleb Dawson's trading concern. He hadn't bought the North Pasture. He'd bought the debt that would force Nathan to sell it. She sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up her pen, opened the ledger to a fresh page, and started writing down everything she knew, in the order she knew it, because this was no longer a problem of margins and grazing rights. This was a problem of documentation, and documentation required a different kind of precision. She wrote until the lamp burned down. She was not afraid of Caleb Dawson, but she understood now exactly what kind of man she was dealing with, and she wanted to make sure when the moment came, and she was increasingly certain the moment was coming, that she was the one who was ready for it. The letter she sent to Missoula came back with a name, not just any name. The name of a land attorney who had handled 3 previous debt conversion cases in the territory situations where a creditor had acquired a struggling rancher's obligation and then engineered the conditions that made default inevitable. The attorney's name was Roland Fitch, and he worked out of a narrow office above a hardware store on the main street of Missoula, and the cattle buyer who gave her the name said, without elaboration, that Fitch was the kind of man who understood exactly how these things worked, because he had spent 15 years watching them happen and another 5 years figuring out how to stop them. She wrote to Fitch the same afternoon. She did not tell Nathan. Not yet. She told herself this was because she wanted to have something concrete before she brought it to him, a plan, not just a suspicion, but she knew there was also a simpler reason, which was that Nathan's first instinct, when confronted with a problem that touched his sense of obligation, was to solve it alone and apologize later for the inconvenience of having had it. She needed him to not do that. She needed him to still be in possession of the North Pasture and the debt obligation and all the relevant paperwork when Fitch responded, and the best way to ensure that was to move fast and tell him when the pieces were in position. She was not proud of the calculation, but she made it anyway. Response from Fitch came in 9 days faster than she'd expected, which told her something about how familiar he was with the specific pattern she described. He confirmed what she had found in the county records, going further than she'd been able to go with the information available to her. The holding account that connected to Caleb Dawson's trading concern was itself a subsidiary of a property acquisition company that had executed 4 similar maneuvers in the past 6 years in 3 different Montana counties. Each case followed the same structure: purchase the debt, apply pressure through the terms, acquire the property at distressed prices when the owner couldn't manage the compressed timeline. Fitch used the word predatory. He used it without apparent hesitation, which she found both useful and sobering. He also said there was a legal avenue. The debt transfer from the original lender to the holding company had been executed with a procedural irregularity, a notice requirement that had not been properly fulfilled under territorial law. It was not a guarantee. It was not even a strong position necessarily, but it was a handle, and a handle was what you needed when everything else was smooth. She folded the letter and put it in the interior pocket of her coat, close to where she kept the ledger pages she'd filled that last long night. Then she went to find Nathan. He was north of his main barn, in a section of fence that ran along the upper boundary of the property, the boundary closest to the pasture that was, right now, the center of everything. He was working with a younger ranch hand, whose name she didn't know, replacing posts that heaved up through the winter freeze, and he didn't see her coming until she was close enough that he couldn't pretend otherwise. Straightened. The ranch hand looked at her with the neutral curiosity of someone who'd heard enough of the situation to have an impression, but knew better than to show it. "Give us a minute," Nathan said to the hand, who gave the fence post a last unnecessary look, and then found something to attend to at a respectful distance. Eliza handed him the letter. He read it. He read it again. He stood with it in his hands, and his face did several things in sequence that she watched because she had learned to read him, and because what moved across his expression in those minutes told her. more than most people told her in direct conversation. First, there was the particular stillness that meant he was processing something unexpected. Then a tightening around his jaw that meant he was angry, not the hot kind, the cold kind, the kind that settles in and doesn't burn itself out in a day. Then something else that took her a moment to identify, and when she did, sat uncomfortably. It was the look of a man who is calculating whether he has been protected when he should have been consulted, and deciding how he feels about the distinction. "How long have you had this?" he said. "Letter came 3 days ago. The information it confirms about 10 days before that." He looked at her. The cold anger was still there, but there was also something working against it. "Tell me." "No. You were investigating this without telling me." "Yes." She held his gaze. "Do you want to be angry about the sequence, or do you want to talk about what it means?" He looked back at the letter. "Both," he said with the flat honesty that was one of the things she trusted most about him. "Fair enough." She let him have a moment with it. The wind moved through the upper pasture grass, which was still winter pale, but beginning to show the first traces of returning color at the roots. "I should have told you when I found the Billings connection. That's the part I'd do differently. That's the part. That's the part." She didn't apologize further because she had found that excessive apology was its own kind of evasion. And Nathan Crowe was sharp enough to notice the difference between someone owning a mistake and someone using an apology to close a conversation. "The rest of it I'd do the same way." He folded the letter, looked out at the north pasture at the land that had absorbed 30 years of his work, that ran up to the ridgeline and caught the morning light from the east, that he had walked every season until he knew it, the way you know something you've earned through sustained attention rather than purchase. "He bought the debt," Nathan said, quietly, not to her specifically. "Yes, he bought it, and he sent the notices incorrectly on purpose. Fitch thinks so. He thinks it was intentional. Keep the procedural defect in place as a fallback, in case the organic pressure didn't produce default in time. If you'd managed the terms on your own somehow, he could have invalidated the debt transfer on his end and renegotiated from a stronger position regardless." Nathan was quiet for long enough that she started to worry about what he was deciding. "I've been dealing with difficult men for 30 years, he said finally. "I've had disputes over property lines, over water rights, over cattle that were claimed by 2 outfits at the same time. I've been lied to by men who shook my hand while they did it." He paused. "I don't think I've seen something this." He stopped himself, folded the letter again, smaller, a precise movement that was using up the energy he wasn't pointing at his voice. He sat in my kitchen. He sat in my kitchen and drank my coffee and made me an offer on the pasture, and he was holding the debt the whole time. Yes, he wanted me to sell to him directly. When I didn't, he went to you. And when that didn't work, she looked at him. The next move is pressure. Time pressure, making the terms harder to manage. Maybe something visible, something that looks like bad luck but isn't. He looked at her. "You think he'll do something to the operation?" "I think he's methodical. I think everything up to now has been sequence. I think if the legal avenue doesn't move fast enough, he'll look for a way to accelerate the default." She watched his face. "I think we should not give him time to find one." They stood in the upper pasture with the letter between them and the fence posts in their uneven row and the land running out toward the ridge, and she waited for him to decide. Not what to do. She thought they both already knew what had to be done, but how to do it together, which was the part that required something from him that she wasn't sure he'd been asked for in a long time. "What does Fitch need?" Nathan said. "The original debt documents, the transfer paperwork, every piece of correspondence from the holding company since the transfer. I have all of it. He'll need to see the notice sequence, specifically the dates and the delivery records, that I can get from the county office." He looked at her. The clerk, with the loose relationship with discretion, is actually useful in this case. Yes, because whatever they told Caleb, the official record is the official record, and the official record is what Fitch needs. Something shifted in his expression. Not the cold anger that was still there. She thought it would be there for a while. Something different. The quality of a man who has been carrying a weight alone and has just been shown, against his expectations, that the weight is distributable. He wasn't comfortable with it. She could see that clearly. He was 60 years old, and he had built every part of his life on the principle of carrying his own things. And being shown a different way at this stage of it was not comfortable. She understood that. She didn't expect him to love it. "I'll get the documents," he said. "I'll write to Fitch tonight with an update." He nodded. And then, after a moment, Eliza, she waited. "I'm not going to say thank you," he said, "because I'm still deciding how I feel about the sequence." "I know." But he stopped. He looked at the fence post nearest him, which was solid and correctly aligned, and clearly not the thing he was thinking about. "But I need you to understand that it matters." He stopped again. The sentence was giving him genuine difficulty, which was how she knew it was something true. "That you thought of this when I didn't. That you moved when I was still managing." She looked at him. "You would have figured it out. Maybe. Slower." He looked back at her, and by then Caleb might have had time for the next move. She nodded. She thought about saying more. There were several more things she could have said, things that were true and relevant, and that the moment might have technically supported, but she had learned some things about Nathan Crowe in 3 years of an odd and functional arrangement, which was that he absorbed things at his own pace, and pushing past the pace didn't add anything and usually removed something. She let the moment be what it was. She rode back to her property and wrote to Fitch. First blizzard of the season arrived on a Thursday, which nobody had predicted. Not entirely without warning, the sky had been wrong. For 2 days, a particular yellowish cast to the afternoon light that experienced ranchers read as pressure changing, but the speed of it was wrong. By the time the temperature had dropped 30 degrees in 6 hours, and the wind had gone from manageable to the kind that pushed cattle off their feet, everyone in the valley was behind where they needed to be. Eliza was in her east pasture when the full force of it hit. She had 4 ranch hands with her garret and 3 seasonal workers she'd hired for the late winter push, and they were moving the last of the vulnerable cattle toward the lower shelter when the visibility collapsed. From poor to almost nothing in less than 10 minutes. She'd seen bad weather before. She had not seen it close that fast. "Don't lose each other," she said, shouted, because the wind had reached the pitch where normal speech was just air. "Keep the cattle moving. Stay on the rope." She had established a guide rope from the east pasture to the shelter 3 years ago. Specifically for this scenario, a decision that other ranchers in the valley had found either unnecessarily cautious or quietly impressive, depending on their disposition. Right now it was the difference between getting the cattle in and losing them. She took the front position on the rope, and they moved in a line through the whiteout, following the tension in the cable. She couldn't see but could feel in her hands through the gloves. It took 40 minutes to cover ground that should have taken 10. When the last animal was in the shelter and the doors were latched against the wind, she stood for a moment in the relative quiet of the interior relative, because the storm was loud enough to hear through timber walls, and took stock. Cattle, all accounted for. 4 hands, all present. One of the seasonal workers had taken a fall somewhere in the whiteout, and his left knee was wrong. He was walking, but walking carefully, and she made a note to look at it more closely when there was light. "Garrett," she said. "Crow's north pasture," he said, which meant he'd already been thinking the same thing. The north pasture boundary sat at a higher elevation than her sheltered land. The Crow operation had covered shelters for most of the herd, but the cattle in the north pasture, the section that Caleb Dawson wanted, that Fitch was trying to protect, that represented a significant portion of Nathan's operating value, those cattle were exposed. She knew from the last conversation she'd had with Hitch that there were close to 60 head up there, and that the shelter in that section was a secondary structure that Nathan had been meaning to reinforce before spring, meaning past tense of intention. She looked at Garrett. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who already knew what was coming and was only waiting for the word. "Can you manage here?" "We're good here," he said. She went back out into the storm. She nearly didn't make it to the boundary. The wind on the open ground between the properties was a different animal from the wind in the sheltered pasture. It came from two directions at once, or seemed to, a shifting pressure that pushed her sideways when she expected resistance from the front. Her horse was good in bad weather, but not invincible, and twice she felt the animal's footing go uncertain on ground that had frozen over under the wind, chill in ways the morning ground hadn't predicted. She made the boundary fence, followed it north. She could feel the posts even when she couldn't see them, counting them to track distance, and found the gate that gave access to the upper section. It was latched but not locked. She went through. She found Hitch first. He was trying to move the cattle by himself in conditions that made solo work essentially impossible. Not because he wasn't capable, but because 60 head of panicked cattle in a whiteout wasn't a solo operation under any conditions. He saw her come through the visibility, and his expression did something that she thought might, on a less weather-beaten face, have been relief. "How many of your people can you spare?" he shouted. "None right now." "Where's Nathan?" "East side, there's a gap in the lower fence. Cattle were going through before the visibility went." He went to close it. Hitch pointed, which was useless in zero visibility, but a human instinct that she didn't fault him for. 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes in these conditions was a long time. "Start moving them toward the secondary shelter," she said. "I'll come back with help." She found Nathan by sound before she found him by sight. There was a rhythm to the sound of someone working in a storm that was distinctive once you knew it. Pattern of effort and pause that she had learned to identify without consciously deciding to. He was at the fence gap, working with wire that kept freezing as he tried to twist it closed, his hands doing the by-feel because looking at it was not the option the weather was offering. She came up beside him and took one end of the wire without saying anything, startled slightly. He hadn't heard her coming, and then when he saw who it was, something crossed his face that she read clearly even through the weather. Not gratitude, something before gratitude. Something that looked like the expression of a person who has been telling themselves they are managing and has just been shown, without argument, that the managing has reached its limit. They got the fence closed. It was not good fence work. It was storm work, holding action work, the kind of repair that would need to be done properly in better conditions, but it would hold the cattle from going through. "The herd in the north section," she said, her voice raised against the wind. "Hitch is trying to move them. We need more hands. My people are all on the main shelter. I have Garrett and 3 men in my south shelter. Cattle are in. He can spare 2. Nathan looked at her through the white. His face was rimed with ice at the eyebrows and across the scarf he'd wrapped, and she imagined she looked similarly constructed from bad weather. "You came out in this," he said. "Not quite a question. The north pasture cattle. I know why." He looked at her for a moment longer. "I know why," he said again, differently. Then he turned back toward the upper section. "Let's go." They moved the cattle together. Garrett sent 2 men when she reached the boundary. They came through the fence gap with the particular efficiency of people who had been told the situation and decided it was not a day for caution. And with 4 people working the herd, the movement became possible where it had been impossible alone. Still took 3 hours. The secondary shelter was undersized for 60 head, and the temperature inside was what you'd call barely survivable for the animals, rather than comfortable. She checked every animal she could reach in the press of the interior. Lost an older cow that had been compromised before the storm, she thought, from the condition of it, and counted that as the toll of the weather rather than the toll of the rumsts, which was the best you could say about a winter bad enough to reach that conclusion. Nathan was aware of the lost animal, the way ranchers are always aware of every animal, a specific accounting that sat separate from the others. She didn't say anything about it. There was nothing useful to say. When the worst of the wind had dropped enough to think and speak at normal volume, they were in the secondary shelter together, both of them sitting on the ground against the far wall, with the cattle settling around them in the reduced space. And she was looking at the structural condition of the shelter ceiling and thinking about the reinforcement work that hadn't happened before spring. "This shelter needs work," she said. "I know." Not before this storm is done, but before next winter. I know, Eliza. She looked at him. He was exhausted in a way that she could see in his body rather than his face, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been operating at maximum capacity for an extended period and is now sitting in the aftermath of it. He was not young. He was not pretending to be, but he was also still here, still accounting for every animal, still aware of the ceiling and what it needed. Caleb Dawson didn't come out in this storm, she said. Nathan looked at her. I'm not making a point, she said. I'm just noting a fact. He was quiet for a moment. He wouldn't have known to, he said finally. He doesn't know what this land does in weather like this. He's never had to. No, he knows the numbers. He doesn't know the thing. She thought about that. She thought about the document Caleb had pressed flat against her kitchen table, and his fingers, and his certainty, and his careful gentleness that was doing something that wasn't gentle at all. She thought about the ledger pages she'd written by lamplight and Fitch's letter in the inside pocket of her coat, still there, slightly damp now from the crossing. Procedural defect Fitch found, she said. If we can move the legal process, before Caleb realizes we know about it, before he has time to correct the record or argue it differently, we need to file something. Fitch said he could file a challenge to the debt transfer within 14 days of receiving the documentation, which means we need to get the documents to him. In this storm, when it breaks, she looked at the ceiling again. 2 days at the outside for the weather. Then the roads will be slow but passable. I can ride the documents to the county relay stations myself. They move mail, even in bad conditions. So that's a long ride. I've made longer. He looked at her with the expression she'd stopped trying to fully classify because it was too many things at once, and she was too tired right now to sort them all. You don't have to do all of this, he said. You keep saying versions of that because you keep doing versions of things you don't have to do. She turned to look at him directly. They were close in the shelter. The press of the cattle had reduced the available space to something that would have been awkward in a different context and was merely practical in this one. Close enough that she could see the line of ice melt on the side of his face where his scarf had shifted and the cold had done its work. Nathan, she said quietly, because they were alone. In the relevant sense, the ranch hands were at the shelter entrance, and the animals were their own kind of noise. I need you to stop treating what I'm doing as something that requires justification. I'm not here because I made a calculation about what's owed. I'm here because... She stopped. She was tired, and when she was tired, the careful architecture of what she kept and what she released was less reliable. I'm here because this is where I need to be right now. That's all. He held her gaze for a long moment. That's not all, he said. She didn't answer. She looked back at the ceiling. That's not all, he said again. Not pushing it, just putting it on record. She pulled her coat tighter and said nothing, and after a moment, he looked back at the cattle and said nothing. And they sat in the close warmth of the undersized shelter while the storm did its work outside, and the animals shifted and settled around them like something ancient and ongoing. The storm ran 2 full days. When it broke the way Montana storms often did, not gradually but decisively, as though the weather had finished a task and moved on to the next one. The morning of the 3rd day was crystalline and brutally cold but clear, and the valley emerged from under the snow with the temporary blank quality of something waiting to be rewritten. The damage assessment took most of that day and part of the next. On Nathan's property, the north pasture fence, in 2 additional sections, beyond the gap they'd closed in the storm. Secondary shelter roof in a partial collapse at the eastern end, which had held during the weather, but it lost its argument with accumulated snow weight afterward, and the loss of the 1 animal she'd tallied in the shelter, plus 2 more that had been in the main pasture and hadn't made it to cover in time. On her own property, significant feed loss from a storage structure that had failed, a collapsed section of the east fence, and one of the seasonal workers, whose knee, as she'd suspected, was broken rather than sprained. She sent the worker to the town doctor. She filed the fence damage in her ledger with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned to record disasters without flinching, because flinching didn't change the numbers. Calculated the feed loss and what it meant for the spring margin, and found that the margin was now thin enough to be uncomfortable, though survivable. Then she got the documents from Nathan, all of them, neatly organized in the way of a man who, despite everything, kept his paperwork in order, and she rode to the county relay station. The ride was 4 hours each way in post-storm conditions that made every mile deliberate work. The relay clerk at the station was a small man named Aldous, who wore the same coat every season, regardless of temperature, and who processed everything with the specific competence of someone who had been doing one job correctly for many years and was not interested in doing anything else. She gave him the packet for Fitch. She paid for the expedited rate without discussion. "Anything coming back to you I should hold or forward?" Aldous said. "Forward," she said. "I don't know where I'll be." She rode back. She was 2 miles from the Whitmore gate when she saw the wagon. It was sitting on the main track between her property and Nathan's not traveling. Sitting, which meant it had stopped specifically in this location for a specific reason. The horse on the wagon was a good one, not a working animal. She knew it before she was close enough to see who was holding the reins. Caleb Dawson looked at her across the post-storm landscape with an expression that was still calibrated for pleasantness, but had something underneath it now that the pleasantness was working harder to cover. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "You're out early, I am." She did not stop her horse. She came to a natural halt at a distance that was not quite conversational, close enough to hear clearly, far enough to make a point. "I heard you were out in the storm," he said. "On the Crowe property." "I was. Good neighbor," he said. He said it with the inflection of a man testing the weight of a phrase to see if it will carry what he's putting in it. "I've always said you were that." She looked at him, thought about the letter in her coat, gone now, sent in the hands of the relay, and about the documents that were moving toward Fitch, and about the 14-day window that had started this morning. "Was there something you needed?" she said. He shifted the reins. "I've been thinking about the situation with Nathan's property. Debt situation. I imagine after the storm the margins are." He paused as though calculating the right degree of delicacy, more complicated than they were. "I imagine so. There's still an offer on the table. Fair one." And the timeline, he looked at her with steady eyes. "The timeline is something I have some flexibility on, given the right circumstances." She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that she saw something in his careful expression begin to recalibrate a slight adjustment, a checking of assumptions. "Caleb," she said, "I want to be straightforward with you." "I appreciate that," he said. "I know about the holding company. I know about the debt transfer. I know about the notice defect." She said it evenly, factually, the way she gave numbers. "I know that you've been engineering this situation since before you walked into my kitchen. I know that the offer you're describing as fair is structured to arrive at a price you set by manufacturing the pressure that creates it." He was very still. "So when you talk about flexibility," she said, "and when you talk about the right circumstances, I want you to understand that I know what you mean by those words. And I want you to understand that the circumstances you're imagining don't exist." Pleasantness was still on his face, but it had gone thin in a way that showed what was behind it. "That's a significant claim," he said carefully. "It's documented," she said. "Beat. Another. You're making an enemy," he said, and this time the pleasantness was entirely gone. "I'm identifying one," she said. "That's a different thing." She rode past him and didn't look back. Her hands were perfectly steady on the reins. She noticed this with a kind of removed appreciation, the way you notice good function in a piece of equipment under pressure. She had been afraid. She thought afraid, in the specific way you are afraid, when you say a true thing to someone who has demonstrated they are willing to cause harm. But the fear had gone through her, rather than stopping in her, and what remained was something clean and clear and cold that felt not unlike the air after a storm. She reached her gate. She went inside and put water on and sat at her table and looked at the ledger and thought about 14 days, about what Fitch would do with the documents, about what Caleb would do when he understood that the legal avenue was closing, about what the next move looked like from his position, because she had told him she knew, and that changed his calculations, and she needed to be 2 steps ahead of the change. Nathan came that evening. He knocked, which was unusual. He generally announced himself by the sound of his horse, and she generally met him at the door, and they generally did not observe formalities that both of them found slightly unnecessary. The knock meant something specific. She opened the door. He looked at her in a way that said he'd heard about the conversation on the road. News moved fast in a valley this size. Hitch told me, he said. Assumed. You told him you'd documented it. I have. Stood at the threshold. She hadn't invited him in, yet. They were both still in the doorway, which meant this was a doorway conversation, and she let it be one. He had the look of a man who has been thinking very hard about something for several hours, and has arrived at the end of his thinking. I need you to tell me everything, he said. All of it, from the beginning. Everything you did, and everything you know, and everything that's in motion. I was going to, she said. I know I'm asking now. She stepped back from the door. He came in. She put 2 cups on the table and poured the coffee, her coffee, not his, which was better, and she sat down and told him all of it in order. From the day in the trading post, when Meredith had given her the look-through to the documents on their way to Fitch and the conversation on the road, and what Caleb's face had done when she'd said the word documented. He listened without interrupting, which was a thing he was better at than most people. He asked 3 questions, all precise, all aimed at the specifics he needed to understand the structure of what was in motion. She answered all 3 completely. When she was done, he sat with it for a while. He'll move faster now, Nathan said. Yes, he'll try something before the 14 days. That's my expectation. He looked at her across the table. What does he have left to work with? She thought about it carefully, because the answer mattered, and she wanted to give him the accurate one rather than the reassuring one. He can try to contest the procedural claim before Fitch files. It argue the defect was technical rather than substantive. He can try to accelerate the default trigger through some kind of interference with the operations, something that looks like an accident or bad luck. He can try to pressure people around us, other ranchers, the county clerk, anyone in a position to complicate the documentation. Or all 3. Or all 3. Nathan nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee cup and held it without drinking. You told him you documented it. Yes. That was, he paused, not to find a criticism, she thought, but because he was deciding what the thing actually was. That was a risk. It was a calculation. If he knows we have the documentation, the interference options become more complicated for him. He has to assume everything he does is being watched and recorded. It narrows what he can try. It also makes him more dangerous. Yes, she said, but he was already dangerous. The difference is now I'm not pretending otherwise. Nathan looked at her. He set the cup down. He did the thing she'd seen him do when he was processing something that required adjustments to existing assumptions, a slight compression around the eyes, a long exhale through the nose. I've been doing this a long time, he said. Ranch work, land work, fighting for something worth keeping. I know. I've done most of it alone, not because I preferred it, because that's how it went. He looked at his hands on the table. My wife, Margaret, she understood the land. She was good at different parts of it than I was. We worked well together. He paused. When she was gone, I made the mistake of thinking that was the only time that was possible, kind of working together, that it was specific to her, to us, that it didn't translate. Eliza didn't say anything. She understood that this was a speech that had required a significant amount of time and private struggle to arrive at, and interrupting it would have been a violence. You've shown me something different, he said. He looked up at her. I don't know how to say it without... He stopped. I don't want to say it wrong. You're not saying it wrong, she said quietly. He held her gaze. Something in his face was open in the way she'd been seeing it more frequently, the undefended expression. The one that didn't know what to do with itself, except that it was getting better at standing its ground. It was not flinching back as quickly. I want to finish this, he said. Caleb's situation. The legal process. I want to finish it, and I want to know what's left when it's over. What's left, she repeated. Between us. He said it simply and without decoration, which was how he said everything that mattered. I want to know what's left. The lamp was low. Outside, the post-storm cold had settled into the particular stillness that followed hard weather in the valley, a held-breath quality, the land, recovering, consolidating, reassessing what it had just been through. Finish it first, she said. He nodded. It was not the answer he had hoped for, she thought, but it was the honest one. And he received honest answers the way he received most things. Without drama, with consideration, the kind of patience that was not passive, but was a choice made repeatedly. He finished his coffee. She walked him to the door. At the threshold he turned, and for a moment they were close in the doorway, the same way they had been close in the undersized shelter. And he looked at her with the open expression and said nothing, because there was nothing left that needed saying tonight. She closed the door behind him and listened to the sound of his horse moving away down the track. 14 days, she thought, and whatever Caleb Dawson was going to try in the meantime. She went back to the table and opened the ledger to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top and began to plan. The first thing Caleb did was go to the bank. She found out through Garrett, who found out through the kind of informal network that exists in every small community, where people who work land talk to other people who work land. And information moves not through gossip exactly, but through the shared understanding that what happens to one operation has implications for the rest. The Harlan branch of the Territorial Bank had a loan officer named Prescott, who was not a bad man but was a careful one, the kind of careful that expressed itself as deference to whoever in a given room had the most apparent authority. Caleb had spent 3 years cultivating exactly that kind of deference from exactly that kind of man, and the morning after Eliza's conversation on the road, he had sat in Prescott's office for the better part of an hour. What was discussed, Garrett's source couldn't say with certainty. What came out of the meeting, within 2 days, was a quiet communication to 3 ranchers in the valley, whose operations had periodic borrowing arrangements with the Bank of Bank, a reminder, framed with exquisite politeness, that certain lending terms were contingent on the general health of the regional cattle market, which was itself contingent on a number of factors, including the stability of the larger operations in the valley. It was not a threat. It was the shape of a threat rendered in the language of banking correspondence, which meant it was untouchable and perfectly clear. Eliza read the communication when one of the affected ranchers, a quiet man named Burl Estes, who ran a small but tidy operation east of town, and who had more spine than most people gave him credit for, rode to her property on a gray morning and handed her his copy without preamble. "I thought you should see it," Burl said. He was standing at her gate, hat in his hands the way people hold hats when they're being serious. "After what I heard about the road," she read it. She read it twice to make sure she understood the mechanism. "He's trying to isolate," she said. "That's how I read it." Burl looked at the letter in her hands. "There are 2 others who got the same, Henley and the Marsh widow. Neither of them is going to want trouble with the bank. They can't afford that kind of attention on their loans. Are they frightened enough to act against us?" Burl thought about it with the honesty of a man who had considered his neighbors carefully over many years. "Frightened enough to stay out of it," he said. "Not frightened enough to work against you. There's a difference." "There is," she agreed. She handed the letter back. "Thank you for bringing this. What are you going to do?" She looked at him. "Document it," she said. And she meant it precisely. She was going to write down the date, the nature of the communication, and the connection to the timeline of her conversation with Caleb on the road. Because Fitch had told her when she'd written him a follow-up letter that any evidence of coordinated pressure following legal challenge activity was itself useful to the challenge. She went inside and did exactly that. Then she wrote another letter to Fitch, describing what had happened. Fitch's response came back in 5 days faster. Each time now, she noticed as though the velocity of events was communicating itself through the mail, and it said 2 things she needed to hear. The first was that the documentation of the bank communication was useful and should be preserved in its original form if possible. The second was that he had found a second procedural irregularity in the debt transfer, smaller than the first, but compounding it in a way that strengthened the challenge significantly, and that he was ready to file within the week. That meant Caleb had less time than he'd calculated, if he'd been calculating from the original 14-day window she thought he had been. She told Nathan that evening, when she crossed to his property, not in the barn this time, but on the porch, because the weather had broken into something that was almost bearable, and he'd been doing repair work on the porch boards when she arrived, and stopped to hear her. He listened to the bank communication detail with an expression that moved through several things and settled on the cold anger she recognized. Burl Estes, he said, good man, yes. Henley and the Marsh widow, staying out of it, which is their right. He looked at the middle distance. Caleb's running out of moves that don't involve something visible, he said. Something people can see. That's what concerns me. The operation, he said, it wasn't a question. He'd been thinking the same thing. She had been thinking about it since the conversation on the road. The interference options she'd described to Nathan that night, something that looks like an accident. The cattle in the north pasture were the obvious target, both because of their value and because of the specific legal significance of that land. But obvious targets were also watch targets, and she'd told Garrett to double the presence in the north section since the storm without explaining the full reason. Hitch knows? She asked. Hitch has known something was wrong since Caleb's first visit, Nathan said. I told him the outline after your barn conversation. He's been watching the boundary fence every morning. I want to put Garrett on the east boundary at night, she said. Starting tonight. He looked at her. You think he'll move that fast? I think we've given him every reason to. We've documented, we've challenged, we've told him to his face that we know. Faster Fitch files, the smaller his window. She met his eyes. I'd rather have Garrett out there for nothing than not have him out there at all. All right. He said it, without argument, which meant he agreed and was past the part of this where he was going to object to her making operational decisions on his behalf. That had taken some time to arrive at, she thought. She was glad it had. Garrett went to the east boundary that night. He took the steadiest of the 3 seasonal workers with him, the one whose knee had healed well enough for night work, and they settled into a rotation that looked, from the outside, like nothing in particular. 3 nights of nothing. On the 4th night, at an hour somewhere between midnight and the first suggestion of pre-dawn gray, Garrett rode back to her window and knocked until she came to it. 2 men, he said when she opened the sash, east side of the north pasture boundary. They had wire cutters. She was dressed in under 2 minutes. Did they get through? No. We saw them early enough they ran when they knew they were seen. Left the cutters. He paused. I know one of them. Works for the loading operation at the Eastern Mill. Caleb's place. She stood in the cold air coming through the window and absorbed this. You're sure? I've seen him 3 times in the yard there. I'm sure. She closed the window. She went to her desk and wrote down the time, the date, what Garrett had seen, the name of the man identified, and the employer connection. She wrote it in the same ledger as everything else, in the same careful hand, adding it to the record that was becoming. She allowed herself to think this, just briefly something that looked like a case. Then she wrote to Fitch again. This one she marked urgent and paid twice the relay rate. The morning Fitch filed the challenge was a Tuesday, 10 days after she'd sent the documents. She knew because he sent her a copy of the filing notice by the same relay system with a cover letter that was 2 sentences long. The challenge had been entered. With the territorial court in Missoula, a hearing date would be set within 30 days. 30 days felt like a long time. She understood from the filing notice that it wasn't in legal terms, it was actually fast. Fitch had written, given the complexity of what was being argued. But 30 days was 30 days, and Caleb still had 30 days to work with, and she had watched him long enough now to understand that he was not a man who accepted a narrowing window gracefully. He didn't. The first sign was what happened to her feed supply. She had an arrangement with a supplier out of the county seat, a man named Cooper, who had been reliable for 4 years, who gave her a fair price in exchange for consistent volume, and who had never once been late with a delivery in their entire arrangement. The delivery due on the 15th of the month didn't come. She waited a day, which was within tolerance. Then she sent a message. Cooper's response came back through his assistant, not Cooper himself, which was the first wrong note. The assistant said there had been a scheduling conflict. Rearrangements were being made. The delivery would be the following week. She didn't believe it. She sent a message directly to Cooper's home address rather than the business, something she had never needed to do before. He responded within 2 days, brief, slightly stiff, the handwriting of a man being careful. He wrote that he regretted the delay and looked forward to resuming their arrangement at the earliest opportunity. Resuming, not continuing. Resuming, she thought about that word for a long time. She found an alternative supplier within 3 days at a higher price and lower volume than she preferred, but functional. She rerouted the logistics, absorbed the cost difference in the ledger, and sent Cooper a professional note, thanking him for 4 years of reliable service and indicating that she had made other arrangements. She wrote it without accusation, because accusation required proof she didn't have in writing, and without warmth, because warmth wasn't the appropriate register for a man who had allowed himself to be used as a tool without the courtesy of warning her. Added the feed disruption to the ledger. Date, nature, cost differential, pattern. Nathan had a parallel problem with a piece of equipment, a mechanical component for the windmill pump system that served the upper pasture, ordered 3 weeks prior from a supplier in the county seat that was now apparently unavailable. The supplier had no record of the order. Nathan had the receipt. The supplier had no explanation. When they compared notes, sitting at her kitchen table on a gray Wednesday afternoon with both their ledgers open, the pattern was obvious. Different suppliers, different goods, the same timing. Caleb was pressuring their supply lines, not dramatically, not in ways that created immediate crisis, but in ways designed to accumulate, to compress, to increase the daily friction of operating until the margin tipped. He's not trying to collapse us outright, Nathan said. He said it with the analytical flatness of a man who was angry but had disciplined the anger into something useful. He's trying to wear us down before the hearing. Yes. She looked at her ledger. The hearing is 30 days out, and he can increase our operating costs by 15% per week. By the time the hearing arrives, we're in a weaker position, even if we win the legal argument. He looked at her, which is what he wants. Win the hearing. Inherit an operation that's already compromised. We need to move the hearing date, she said. Can Fitch do that? I don't know. I'm going to ask. She was already calculating what grounds, what argument, what Fitch could put in front of the court that would justify an accelerated timeline. If we can demonstrate active interference with operations, which we now have documented across multiple suppliers, and the attempted fence breach, there might be grounds for an emergency motion. Nathan looked at her ledger, and then at his own, and then at her. You've been keeping all of this, everything. From the beginning, from Caleb's first visit to my kitchen. She met his eyes. I told you I had documentation. He was quiet for a moment. There was something in his expression she'd been seeing more of lately, not just the open, undefended look, but something more settled in it, something that was no longer surprised to find her capable of things he hadn't accounted for. She didn't know how to say that she found this both validating and slightly irritating, so she said nothing. Write to Fitch, he said. I'll cover the relay fees. Can cover my own. Eliza, he said her name with a kind of quiet finality. Let me cover the relay fees. She looked at him. She thought about arguing and decided it wasn't the argument that mattered right now. Fine, she said. She wrote to Fitch that evening. The response came in 4 days, which meant Fitch had turned it around in roughly a day and a half, which meant he'd been waiting for exactly this kind of documentation. He wrote that the pattern of supply interference, combined with the evidence of the attempted fence breach, constituted sufficient grounds for an emergency motion on the basis of ongoing harm to the parties to the legal dispute. He had already drafted the motion. He needed one thing from her: formal statement, signed, describing the pattern of events in her own words, with dates and specifics, and her attestation to their accuracy. She wrote it in a single sitting at her kitchen table, 3 hours of precise and unornamental prose, every date correct, every detail verifiable against the ledger entries she'd made in real time. She didn't editorialize. She didn't characterize Caleb Dawson as anything other than the party whose employees and associates had done the specific things she described. Because characterization was the place where statements lost their force, and she knew this from watching how men with bad intentions used emotional language to dismiss women with accurate information. Kept it factual. She kept it devastating. Nathan came the following morning, and she read it to him before she sealed it. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he sat for a moment. "You should have been an attorney," he said. "I should have been a lot of things," she said. "I'm a rancher. This needed to be done." She sealed it and sent it by the first relay of the day. The hearing was moved. Fitch sent word in 6 days. The court had granted the emergency motion. The hearing was in 12 days, not 30, and it would be held at the county courthouse rather than Missouri, which meant the practical cost of attending was manageable rather than prohibitive. 12 days. She thought about all the things that could go wrong in 12 days. She thought about them systematically, which was the only way she knew to think about things that frightened her, and she found that the list was shorter than she'd expected, and that most of the items on it were manageable. What Caleb had left was diminishing. He could continue the supply interference, but she had rerouted enough of the critical lines that it was now more nuisance than crisis. He could try the fence again, but Garrett was still on the boundary, and the wire cutters his men had left behind were sitting in a box in her barn, documented and dated. He could try something social, one more attempt to pressure the community against them. But she had noticed, in the days since the storm, something shifting in the Valley's opinion. The shift was subtle. It was not the dramatic reversal of public sentiment that happened in stories, where a town suddenly realizes it was wrong. It was smaller than that and more honest, the specific discomfort of people who had been watching two ranchers they knew to be decent work. A problem they could see was serious, while a third party they were beginning to understand was something other than what he appeared, continued to apply pressure in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to misread if you were paying attention. Burl Estes was paying attention. He came by again, the week before the hearing, this time with his wife, a quiet woman named Dottie, who had opinions she kept carefully packaged but who was not. Eliza had always suspected a woman to underestimate. They brought food, which was the frontier idiom for solidarity, and they sat for an hour and talked about nothing related to legal proceedings, because there was nothing useful left to say on that topic, and because sometimes what you needed from people was just the evidence of their presence. Clara Potts came by, not with the concerned expression she'd worn before, with a different face, one that Eliza recognized as embarrassed and was trying to resolve into something more useful. She stayed for coffee. She didn't apologize for what she'd said about Nathan's age, but she asked, carefully, whether there was anything she could do. Eliza told her to keep being a reasonable person in the conversations that were happening around her. Clara said she could manage that. Even Patricia Soames, who had cornered her outside the post office with the most exhausting version of the community's concern, had apparently shifted. She had told Meredith at the dry goods counter that she'd always thought Caleb Dawson's trading concern had undercut the established posts a little too aggressively, which was not a political statement exactly, but was the kind of thing that, coming from Patricia, functioned as one. Told Nathan about it on one of their evening conversations, the shifts, small recalibrations. the way the community was quietly repositioning itself, without anyone having to say anything explicit. He listened with the expression of a man who was genuinely surprised, which was not a frequent expression for him. "People are better than I give them credit for," he said finally. "Sometimes," she said, "when they have enough information and enough time, and when someone gives them a reason to look more carefully." She looked at him. Don't what? Don't make it about what I did. I documented things and sent letters." The situation made itself clear. "The situation," he said, with a dryness she recognized as affection turned sideways, did not send itself to Missoula in post-storm conditions to deliver documents to a relay station. He said nothing. "Or spend 3 hours writing a statement that Fitch described in his last letter, which I read, with your permission, as the most precisely constructed supporting document he'd seen filed in a territorial case in 7 years. She had not known. Fitch had said that she absorbed the information and put it somewhere private. "He's prone to exaggeration," she said. "He's a lawyer," Nathan said, "trained out of exaggeration." She looked at him across her kitchen table and thought about the night he'd come to her door after the road conversation and asked her to tell him everything. She thought about how that had felt, the being asked, the being trusted with the full accounting rather than a managed portion of it. She thought about how different that was from what she'd expected, and how much more difficult it was to know what to do with than a simpler dynamic would have been. "Nathan," she said. He waited. "After the hearing," she said it carefully. "Whatever happens with the hearing, whatever the outcome is, I want to talk about what comes next. The operation. How we're running things across both properties." She paused. "There's been a shared grazing arrangement in place since winter. Garrett and Hitch have been coordinating. It's been functional." "More than functional," he said. "Yes, more than functional." She met his eyes. "I think there's a case for making it more formal, more deliberate. Not just a response to a crisis, but a structure." He looked at her with the open expression, the undefended, the one she'd cataloged in different versions over 3 years and had never quite stopped, finding difficult to look at directly. "What kind of structure?" he said. "I haven't worked out all the specifics." That was true. She had worked out some of the specifics. In the ledger, in the margins, in the part of her thinking she hadn't admitted to yet. "I'd want to discuss it properly after the hearing," he said. "After the hearing." He nodded. Something in him was very still, the good kind, not the braced kind. The kind of still that meant he was holding something carefully because it mattered. "All right," he said. The night before the hearing, Caleb Dawson made his last move. She found out at 10 o'clock, when Hitch rode to her gate with his horse lathered and his expression wrong, in a way that made her stomach drop before he said a word. "Someone's been to the county clerk," he said. "The records office. Copy of the original debt, documents, the ones that show the transfer date, and the notice sequence. Someone's been in there. The clerk found it this evening when he went to pull the file for the hearing tomorrow." She stood very still. "Found what?" "Pages are missing. Not the whole file. Specific pages, the ones with the transfer notice dates." She did not let herself react for the 3 seconds it took to understand what had happened and what it meant. Then she said, "When did the clerk discover this?" "This evening. He came to Nathan directly. He's known Nathan 30 years. Didn't know who else to trust." "Where is Nathan?" "At the clerk's office. He said to come get you." She rode to the county clerk's office, a small building adjacent to the courthouse that smelled of paper and lamp oil, and the specific anxiety of bureaucratic order confronting disorder, and found Nathan and the clerk, a man named Alderman, who was visibly distressed in the way of someone whose professional pride was deeply invested in the integrity of the records he kept. Alderman was 60-something, meticulous and furious, not at Eliza, not at Nathan at the violation itself. "In 31 years, he said. When she came in, I have never had a document interfered with. Never. The file was complete yesterday morning. I pulled it myself to prepare for tomorrow. The missing pages," she said. "Describe them." He described them. She listened to the description and felt, somewhere in her chest, the cold, clear feeling she'd had on the road, after telling Caleb what she knew, because she had copies. Not of every document, not of everything Nathan had sent to Fitch, but the specific pages Alderman described the transfer notice dates, the delivery sequence she had transcribed those herself into her ledger in the early days of investigation, when she'd been working from the county records, because she hadn't yet had Nathan's originals. She had written them out by hand, date by date, in the same careful notation she used for everything else. The ledger was at her property. "I need to ride back," she said. Nathan looked at her with an expression that was still catching up to what she was telling him. "You have the dates in my ledger. I transcribed from the county record before I had your originals." She looked at Alderman. "Can the court accept a transcription in place of the original if the transcription can be cross-referenced with other documentation still in the file?" Alderman pulled at his collar. "It is irregular. Can it be done?" He was quiet for a moment, working through it. "If the remaining file documents corroborate the dates in the transcription, and if the transcription can be shown to predate the interference," he looked at her ledger as though he could see it through her coat, "it would be an argument. It's not the same as the original." "No," she said, "but it's what we have." She looked at Nathan. "And we have Fitch's filing, which also contains the dates he transcribed from the originals I sent him. 2 independent transcriptions, both predating tonight." Nathan's expression had resolved into something focused and sharp. "Needs to know tonight. I'll write to him now, not by relay, by rider." "Can you get a rider to Missoula overnight?" "Hitch," Nathan said. "He'll do it." Hitch, who had been standing at the office door with the patience of a man accustomed to being needed in complicated situations, said, "Already figured." She borrowed Alderman's desk and wrote to Fitch in 20 minutes, compact, precise, explaining what had happened and what they had and what she needed him to argue in the morning. She sealed it and gave it to Hitch, who was on a fresh horse and moving north before she'd finished watching him go. Then she rode home for the ledger. Nathan came with her. He said nothing about this, just fell in, alongside her on the track, his horse matching her pace in the dark, and she did not object because there was nothing to object to. At her property she went inside, and he waited on the porch, and she found the ledger on her desks, where she always kept it, opened it to the relevant pages, and stood for a moment looking at her own handwriting. Dates, the sequence, the notice gaps, all of it recorded in pencil, in the methodical hand over 6 years of keeping her own accounts, because nobody was going to keep them for her. She brought it out. He took it from her and held it in both hands and looked at the pages in the porch lamplight, and she watched his face. "You wrote all of this before you even told me what you were doing," he said. "Yes, you were building the record from the start. I didn't know how far it would go," she said. "I just knew that if something was wrong, the thing to do was to document it as I went, not reconstruct later." He looked at her over the top of the ledger. "Eliza." He said her name the way he'd said it in the barn. The first time, not quite a question, not quite a statement, occupying some space between them that didn't have a name yet. "We should get some sleep," she said. "The hearing is at 9. He didn't move immediately. Stood on her porch holding her ledger in the dark, and he looked at her with the expression that she had stopped trying to fully name, but that she understood in the specific way you understand. Something's you've been moving toward for longer than. You admitted as something she was not prepared to walk away from. After the hearing, he said. It was the echo of her earlier words, and it carried the same weight they'd been given the first time. After the hearing, she confirmed. He gave her the ledger. She took it inside. When she came back to close the door, he was already at the gate, already mounting, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him go. She went inside and set the ledger on the table and looked at it, at the accumulated record of 6 months of paying attention, of moving fast, of refusing to be managed, and she thought about what Caleb Dawson had believed when he'd pressed his document flat against her table. She was young, that she was alone. That being underestimated was the same as being diminished. She had never believed that. She had been keeping the receipts. She went to bed. She slept not well, but enough. At 6 in the morning she rose, fed the cattle, checked the east fence, and got dressed in the clothes she wore when she needed to be taken seriously by men who required a visual signal to locate their good manners. At 8:30, she walked into the county courthouse. Nathan was already there. Alderman was there. 3 ranchers from the valley had come, Burl Estes and his wife, and 2 others she hadn't expected. Men who had received the bank letter and had apparently decided that staying out of it was not the same as watching from a distance. The room was small and smelled of wood and paper, and the kind of tension that lives in places where decisions are made. She sat beside Nathan at the table and put the ledger in front of her and waited. The judge, a territorial circuit judge named Halcott, who had seen enough of what the valley produced in the way of disputes to have an expression that was both tired and sharply attentive, called the hearing to order at 9 o'clock precisely. Caleb Dawson sat across the room with his attorney, a man imported from the county seat, whose suit indicated that he had been engaged at some expense. Caleb's face was the face he wore when he was operating at full performance, pleasant, assured, unhurried. He looked at Eliza once, briefly. She looked back. She did not look away first. Fitch appeared. He had ridden through the night, or Hitch had brought him most of the way, and he'd managed the rest, and he looked the way a man looked who had spent the night on a horse preparing an argument, which was to say disheveled in the extremities, but completely collected in the eyes. He set his papers on the table and nodded at her. "The transcription will hold," he said quietly. "I have the filing copy and you have the contemporaneous record. 2 independent sources, both predating the interference. Halcott is going to ask about the methodology." "I kept the ledger in real time," she said. "Dates of each entry are consistent with the rest of the page. Cross-referencing with adjacent entries will show they weren't added later." Fitch looked at her with a quality of professional appreciation. "Good," the hearing began. "She will not think of it afterward as clean." It was not clean. It was an argument in a small room between people with competing versions of reality and the documentation to support them. And there were moments where the other attorney said things that required patience she found difficult to locate, and moments where Halcott asked questions that she was not sure Fitch had answers for. But she had the ledger, and Fitch had the filing copy. An alderman who took the stand with the dignity of a man, defending 31 years of professional pride, testified to the contents of the file before the interference and confirmed what was missing and what remained. And Caleb Dawson's attorney, when asked to produce the holding company's copy of the original transfer notice with the delivery confirmation, produced a document that had a date on it. Fitch caught it in the moment it was handed to the court. She saw it in the way his posture changed, a slight forward lean, a focus that had found its target. He requested, calmly and correctly, that the court note the date on the holding company's copy of the delivery confirmation against the date in the remaining county record. They were different by 11 days, not a small difference. An 11-day gap in a notice sequence that, under territorial law, required delivery within a specific window. The holding company's copy showed a date inside the window. The county record, the part that hadn't been removed, showed a received stamp 11 days later. Someone had altered a date, not in the county record, in the holding company's copy. Halcott looked at the 2 documents for a long time. He looked at Caleb Dawson. He looked at the attorney. He looked, briefly and without expression, at the table where Eliza and Nathan and Fitch were sitting, called a recess. In the hallway, Fitch said very quietly, "That is not a man who's going to let this hearing conclude in the ordinary way." "What does that mean?" Nathan said. "It means he's going to refer it," Fitch said. "The document alteration isn't a civil matter anymore. It's a criminal one." Eliza stood in the hallway of the county courthouse and looked at the door of the hearing room and thought about all of it, from the night in the kitchen with the bad coffee and the imperfect pie, and a sentence she hadn't planned to say, to the frozen valley crossing, and the barn conversation, and the road conversation, and the ledger pages she'd written by lamplight when she should have been sleeping. She thought about Caleb Dawson's pleasant face and his careful language and the way he'd pressed the document flat against her table like he was holding something down. She thought about all the ways it could still go wrong, because she was not a person who assumed otherwise, and she found that the list was shorter now than it had ever been. The recess lasted 20 minutes. When Halcott returned, he referred the matter of the altered document to the territorial prosecutor's office. He suspended the original debt obligation pending the criminal investigation, which meant the North Pasture was not going anywhere for the foreseeable future. It was not an ending. It was the beginning of a different, slower process. She understood that clearly. But Caleb Dawson walked out of the courthouse that afternoon with something he had not walked in with, a problem he hadn't planned for, moving in a direction he could not control, built entirely from the documentation of a woman he had believed could be managed. She stood on the courthouse steps in the afternoon light with Nathan beside her and Fitch going over next steps, with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood that the most important conversations happened in the 10 minutes after a victory, before anyone had time to stop paying attention. Burl Estes came out and shook Nathan's hand without saying much. His wife gave Eliza a look that communicated approximately 3 paragraphs of things that neither of them needed to speak aloud. Nathan stood beside her while Fitch talked, and at some point, his scarred, large, careful hand settled near hers on the courthouse railing. Not quite touching, close enough to be noticed. She noticed. She did not move away. The afternoon was cold and clear, the kind of clear that the valley produced after storms had done their worst, a sharp, unambiguous light that showed everything as it actually was, without the softening effect of weather. She looked out at it and thought, after the hearing, she thought, we're after it now. The territorial prosecutor's office moved with a speed that surprised almost everyone in the valley except Fitch, who had apparently expected it and said so without visible satisfaction, in the manner of someone who had been right too many times to find it remarkable. The investigator arrived from Missoula 12 days after the hearing, a lean, unhurried man named Cord Beaumont, who wore a coat that had seen considerable use, and asked questions with the specific patience of someone who understood that the answers he needed were in the documents, not the dramatics. He spent 2 days at the county records office with Alderman, who was, by all accounts, the most cooperative witness the investigator had encountered in a long career of encountering witnesses who were not. Alderman had his files organized by date, cross-referenced by party, with margin notations in a hand so precise it bordered on mechanical. He was, Eliza thought, when she heard this, a man who had been keeping good records for 30 years and had finally been given a reason that matched the effort. Beaumont came to her property on the 3rd day. Came alone. She's noted. And he came in the morning. She's noted. And he sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee she made. Correctly, he had been aware since the barn conversation about Nathan's version of what correctly meant, and he asked her to walk him through the ledger from the beginning. She did. All of it. In order, the way she'd written Fitch's statement, precise, dated, factual. She showed him the entries made during the storm, and the entries made after the road conversation, and the entries she'd made the night before the hearing, when Hitch had ridden in with the news about the missing pages. He looked at each entry with the focused attention of a man who was building something in his head, cross-referencing as he went. You started keeping this record before you had any legal engagement, he said, not accusatorially, just noting. I started keeping it when I understood that something was being constructed against a person I had reason to watch out for, she said. The legal engagement came after. Why did you believe something was being constructed? She looked at him. Because Caleb Dawson came to my kitchen and asked me to help him get Nathan Crowe's land. And when I said no, he tried to make the ask look like it had never been an ask at all. She paused. A man who is doing something legitimate doesn't require that kind of revision. Beaumont wrote something in his own notebook. She noticed his handwriting was nothing like hers, big and loose, the kind of writing that moved fast and sorted itself out later. Different system. Same function. The men Garrett saw at the fence, he said. The ones who ran. Garrett identified one of them by face and by employment. He's prepared to give a statement. I'll need to speak with him. He's in the north pasture this morning. I can take you. She took him. Garrett gave his statement with the same flat reliability he brought to everything specific, unembellished, ready to answer follow-up questions without changing the story, which was the mark of a man describing what he'd actually seen. Beaumont wrote it all down in the big loose hand and thanked Garrett, who nodded once and went back to what he'd been doing. On the ride back, Beaumont was quiet for a while and then said, "You built a significant record." "I built a factual record," she said. "It's significant because what happened was significant." He looked at her sidelong. "How long have you been running this property?" 7 years this spring. Alone. With good people working for me. He seemed to consider this. The Crowe operation, you've been coordinating with them since the storm. Since before the storm. The coordination during the storm was an extension of arrangements already in place. She looked at the track ahead. We share a boundary. Good boundary management requires communication. She thought she saw something that might have been the beginning of amusement cross his face. But it was brief, and he kept it professional. "Of course," he said. He left that afternoon, with the ledger she gave him the original, keeping the copy she'd made at Fitch's suggestion 2 weeks prior, because she had not gotten this far by being careless with her documentation. He gave her a receipt for it, which she added to the copy ledger, because of course she did. What happened to Caleb Dawson took 3 months to complete and was not dramatic in the way that things in stories are sometimes dramatic, with confrontation and speeches and visible consequences delivered in real time. It was slow and procedural, and it happened largely in offices in Missoula that she never saw between people she had never met, using documents she had provided and arguments she had contributed to but could not attend. Fitch kept her informed by letter, which arrived at irregular intervals, with the specific density of a man who knew his client was paying attention and respected that sufficiently to provide real information rather than reassurance. The holding company was found to have executed the debt transfer with a forged delivery confirmation. The 11-day discrepancy Fitch had caught in the hearing room was under examination, not a clerical error, but a deliberate alteration, executed by someone with access to the company's internal records and carried out specifically to defeat any legal challenge to the notice sequence. The forgery connected, through the company's internal correspondence that Beaumont had subpoenaed, to instructions originating from the company's primary director of operations. Primary director of operations was a man whose salary was paid through a subsidiary of Caleb Dawson's trading concern. Fitch wrote that word subsidiary in his letter with the particular deliberateness of a man who understood that some words needed room around them. Debt transfer was nullified. The original debt obligation between Nathan and the legitimate original lender was restored at the original terms that Nathan had. By the time the nullification came through, managed without default because the spring cattle prices had held, and the shared grazing arrangement had performed exactly as Eliza's extended calculations had suggested it would. The criminal matter remained a separate proceeding, slower, involving parties beyond Caleb himself, the company employees who had executed the forgery, the lawyer who had brought the altered document to the hearing. Caleb was named in the investigation. He was not, in the end, criminally charged himself because the evidence connected him to the structure rather than the execution, and because the law made distinctions that were not always satisfying. Fitch wrote this with the tone of a man who had seen this before and had learned to work within the distinctions rather than be stopped by them. What happened to Caleb Dawson's was this. His trading concern lost the county supply contract. It had held for 2 years when the county commissioners declined to renew it following the investigation's public findings. His bank relationship with Prescott became, Meredith at the dry goods counter reported, noticeably cooler. Two of the three operations he'd been quietly acquiring interest in through the same holding company structure, withdrew from those arrangements and retained their own attorneys. He did not leave Harlan. He did not in the valley, operating his reduced concern with the particular quality of a man who understood that the room's temperature had changed and was not going to change back. She did not celebrate this. She noted it. She noted it the same way she noted feed prices and fence conditions, as information relevant to the current state of things, requiring attention but not requiring ceremony. Nathan heard the final outcome the same afternoon she did. Fitch sent them both copies of the closing summary, and he came to her property that evening, which was by now unremarkable as a pattern. He had been coming most evenings for 2 months, sometimes with a reason, sometimes without one. And she had stopped requiring the reason because his presence had long since stopped feeling like something that needed justification. He sat at her kitchen table. She made coffee. They sat with the closing summary between them and the window, showing the last of the day's light going out of the western sky. "It's done," he said. "The criminal proceeding is still—" "I know. That's not what I mean." He looked at her. "The north pasture is ours. The debt is restored. Fitch is finished." He paused. "Done." She looked at the closing summary, dates and the legal language, and the word nullified, printed in careful type by someone in a Missoula office who had no idea what it had cost to produce the circumstances that allowed them to type it. "Yes," she said, "it's done." He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the window. He looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had worked a piece of land for 30 years, and showed every year of it in the skin and the knuckles and the particular way they held things. "I want to talk about the structure," he said. She had been waiting for this, not with dread, with the specific quality of attention she gave to things that mattered and that she was not entirely sure how to approach correctly. "The operations," she said. "The operations and other things." He looked up at her. "I'm not going to be indirect about this, Eliza. I've been direct about things my whole life, and I'm not going to stop, because this particular conversation is harder than most. All right. The shared grazing arrangement has been good for both operations. The numbers are better than they were before, on both sides. Garrett and Hitch work well together. The boundary management is stronger." He said all of this flatly, in order, as though he were presenting a report. Those are the practical facts, and they argue clearly for making the arrangement permanent and formal. "They do," she agreed. "But that's not the only reason I want to make it permanent and formal." He held her gaze. "I think you know that." She did know that. She had known it for some time, in the way you know things you've been approaching from a careful angle, because the direct approach felt like something that required more than you were sure you had. "Nathan," she said. "Let me finish." He said it quietly, not interrupting, just asking for room. He gave it. "I've been trying to think of how to say this correctly for about 4 months. I've been trying to find the version of it that doesn't put something on you that you didn't ask for, that doesn't assume more than I know." He stopped, and I've come to the conclusion that there isn't a version like that. Every honest version of it puts something on the table and asks you to decide what to do with it. She waited. "I don't want a neighbor," he said. "I want a partner, in the operation and in everything else. In whatever there is left." He looked at her steadily. "I'm 58 years old. I have probably more good years ahead than people in this valley would give me credit for, and fewer than I had at 30. I know that. I'm not asking you to ignore it." He paused. "I'm asking you to decide if it matters as much as everything else." The lamp was low. Outside the valley was quiet in the way it was quiet, after a long season of difficulty, not peaceful exactly, not yet, but beginning to arrive at something that had the shape of rest. She thought about a lot of things in the silence that followed. She thought about the fence post and the bad coffee and the imperfect pie, and the frozen crossing and the barn and the road and the courthouse railing and his hand near hers in the afternoon light. She thought about the 7 years she had spent building something alone. Not because she had preferred it, but because the alternatives had not been worth the trade. thought about what it had felt like in the undersized shelter during the blizzard to sit with someone who did not ask her to be smaller than she was in order to make room for himself. She thought about 30 years. About 30 years of this man working this land with the specific stubbornness that looked like geology from the outside and was something else entirely from the inside, and about the night she had said a sentence she hadn't planned to say and watched his face do something undefended and new. 32 years, she said. He blinked. What? Between our ages. 32 years, she looked at him. When Clara Potts brought it to my kitchen, I told her the number, and she thought I was being dismissive. She paused. I wasn't. I just wasn't afraid of the number. You're not. No. She met his eyes. I've thought about what it means practically. I've thought about it a lot, actually. I'm not going to pretend I haven't. There are things it means that aren't comfortable to think about. I know. But she stopped. The words sat there for a moment, and then she kept going. Because she had not spent 7 years being honest about hard things in order to soften the one that mattered most. But I made a decision a long time ago. I think I made it. The night I crossed the frozen valley with supplies for a man who hadn't asked for them and wouldn't have that the things worth having were not the comfortable things. They were the true things. And whatever this is, she looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at Caleb Dawson on the road and at Halcott in the hearing room, and at every difficult thing she'd ever decided not to look away from whatever. It's the truest thing I've had. Nathan Crowe sat very still, not the braced still, not the startled still, the still of a man who has heard something land exactly where it was aimed and who is taking a moment to let it settle before he trusts himself to speak. The structure, he said finally, and his voice had something different in it, rougher. Not unpleasantly so. Yes, she said, I want it to be a real one. Legal. Documented. He almost smiled at the word, and she did smile, slightly, because they had both earned the right to find it funny. I want Garrett and Hitch to stop treating the boundary like a negotiation and start treating it like an interior fence. That will take some adjustment on Hitch's part, she said. Hitch will manage. He looked at her across the table. And I want the rest of it. I want to stop coming to your door with something in my hand, as though I need an excuse. He paused. Oh? I want to stop going home. She looked at him for a long moment. That's very direct, she said. I told you I was going to be. She stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the dark valley and the stars that were appearing now, sharp and cold and close, in the clear post-storm air. She thought about what she was about to say and whether she was ready for it, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that she was not, because everything was resolved or simple or without the complicated weight of real things, but because she had been ready for a long time and had simply been waiting for the moment to catch up to the readiness. Turned around. Then stop going home, she said. He looked at her. Something moved through his face, not the undefended expression, not exactly, but the thing that came after the undefended expression when a person realized they'd been let in and didn't have to stand at the door anymore. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She sat back down at the table. They sat together in the low lamplight with the closing summary still between them and the quiet of the valley outside, and the coffee going cold in the cups. And they talked about the structure, about Garrett and Hitch, about the spring margins and the north pasture reinforcement, and the secondary shelter roof that still needed proper work before next winter. They talked about practical things for a long time, which was how both of them knew how to talk about the things that weren't practical at all. Formal arrangement between the Whitmore and Crowe operations was registered at the county records office in the second week of May, under Alderman's careful hand, in a document that Fitch had drafted with the specificity of a man who understood that the people signing it had not arrived at this arrangement casually and did not want it treated as though they had. It was a partnership document, not a merger, a partnership, with distinct ownership maintained and shared operational jurisdiction defined across every relevant function. Garrett and Hitch signed as witnesses. Brits Burl Estates signed as a community witness. Aldermanson signed as recorder with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been part of a complicated story from the inside and was glad to see where it ended up. Clara Potts heard about it through Meredith, which was the natural order of things. She sent a note. It was brief and slightly awkward and genuinely warm, which was better than she'd managed before and which Eliza respected accordingly. Patricia Soames told everyone she'd always known Eliza Whitmore had excellent judgment. Meredith told Eliza this with an expression that communicated exactly what she thought of Patricia's revision, and Eliza told her that revision was better than no movement at all, and Meredith said that was a generous position, and Eliza said it was a practical one, which was the same thing in her experience. Nathan's daughter came in June. Her name was Ruth, and she was 26 years old, and she looked like her father around the eyes, and like no one Eliza had ever met in her manner, which was direct in a different way than Nathan's directness, warmer and faster, less inclined to let things arrive in their own time. She arrived with a single trunk and the confidence of a woman who had come a long distance to form her own opinion, and was not going to be rushed into it. She and Eliza were careful with each other for the first 2 days. Not unfriendly careful. Ruth was evaluating, which Eliza understood and did not resent, and Eliza was watching, which Ruth noticed and apparently appreciated. On the 3rd day, Ruth came to find her in the north pasture, where she was checking the fence reinforcement work that Hitch's crew had finally completed, and she stood at the fence line and looked out at the land and said without preamble, "He's different." Eliza kept her hands on the fence wire she was checking. Different from what? From the last 6 years. When I came to visit, Ruth looked at the ridge line. He used to manage everything and everyone, very efficiently, very thoroughly. She paused. He wasn't unhappy, but it was like watching someone run a machine instead of living in a house. Eliza thought about the evening arithmetic, about the grant of seeing the thing she'd recognized before she'd known what to do with it. He's still efficient, she said carefully. Yes, but now he also laughs. Ruth turned to look at her with the direct eyes. I haven't heard him laugh in 6 years. Not that kind. She was quiet for a moment. I wanted to thank you for that. Eliza looked at the fence wire. I didn't do anything particular. He told me, Ruth said, that you crossed a frozen valley in bad weather with supplies he hadn't asked for because you'd done the arithmetic and determined he needed them. She paused. He told me it was the first time in a long time that someone had looked at his situation, responded with something to responded to what was actually there, instead of what he was presenting. She held the fence wire for a moment and said nothing. It's not a small thing, Ruth said. For a man like him. No, Eliza said. I suppose it isn't. They stood at the fence together for a while longer, looking at the north pasture with its healed ground, and its improved shelter and its spring grass coming in thicker than the winter had suggested it would. The land had a way of doing that, absorbing difficulty and producing something from it that you hadn't planned for and couldn't have predicted. Ruth left in August, back to the town where she'd built her own life, with the promise of returning at the end of the year. She hugged Eliza at the gate in the particular way of a woman who has decided something and is communicating it physically, because the words for it are slightly too large for the moment. Eliza hugged her back. Nathan watched this from the porch with an expression she caught in profile, the open one, the settled one, the one that had been visiting his face with increasing frequency since May, and that she was no longer trying to classify because she had come to understand it simply as what he looked like when he was actually where he wanted to be. The autumn that followed was the best season either operation had seen in years. Not because everything went right. Things did not go entirely right, because seasons did not work that way, and neither did operations built by human beings with human limitations. There was a feed calculation that Garrett got wrong in September and had to correct at additional cost. There was a section of the north pasture fence that the reinforcement work had missed, which they found in October when a portion of it gave way in a windstorm that was bad but not catastrophic. There was a week in November when Eliza was sick, genuinely sick, the respiratory kind that flattens a person, for days, during which Nathan managed both operations and did it competently and without making her feel like an invalid, required more social precision than she would have given him credit for before she knew him. She lay in her bed for 4 days running the numbers in her head because she couldn't stop. And on the 3rd day, he sat beside the bed and told her, with the flatness of a man reading a report, the numbers were fine and she could stop running them. She told him she wasn't running them. He told her he could tell when she was doing arithmetic because her eyes moved differently. She told him that was an unreasonable thing to notice about a person. He said she'd had 7 years to notice things about him, and he was making up ground. She didn't have a response to that wasn't going to embarrass her, so she went back to sleep. On the first clear day of December, a cold, bright, unreasonably beautiful day that the valley occasionally produced in winter, as though apologizing it was capable of Nathan, came to find her at the boundary fence between their properties. Not the working boundary, not the north pasture line, the original fence, the one that had marked the edge of the Whitmore property and the beginning of the Crowe land for as long as either operation had existed. The one he'd helped her repair 3 years ago with advice about soil drainage and post anchoring that had been the first real conversation they'd ever had. The fence was good now, better than it had ever been. Posts were deep and correctly anchored, and the wire was new since the spring partnership work, tensioned properly and stapled clean. She was checking the middle section when she heard him come, and turned to find him on his horse, with something in his hand, not a tool, not a supply, something small and folded. He climbed down without ceremony and stood at the fence and held it out to her. She took it. She unfolded it. It was a piece of paper with 3 lines written on it, in his handwriting, the large, deliberate hand of a man who had learned to write for function and had never cared much about style. The lines were not a letter. They were not a formal document. They were 3 lines that said, in plain language, what he wanted, what he was asking for, and what he understood he was asking. She read them twice. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the steady, undefended face, the one that had nothing behind it except the actual thing, the true version, offered without management or revision, or the protective overlay that most people put between themselves and what they actually meant. She thought about imperfect pie and frozen crossings and late nights, with a ledger and a storm that had pressed 60 panicked and cattle into an undersized shelter, while 2 people sat against the wall and said things they hadn't intended to say. She thought about the courthouse railing and his hand close to hers in the afternoon light. Thought about 7 years of building something alone and what it meant to stand at a fence line with a man who had never once asked her to be different than she was. She folded the paper carefully. She put it in her coat pocket next to where she used to keep Fitch's letter, in the place she kept things she was going to hold on to. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment as though verifying that she meant it and that it was what he'd heard. Yes, she said again, more simply. Something happened to his face. Not the expressive kind of something, the quiet kind, the internal kind, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because the person feeling it was not someone who had ever needed an audience for the things that mattered to him. He came around the fence gate, opened it properly, closed it behind him, because he was not a man who left gates open, and he stood beside her in the December light, on the Whitmore side of the fence that was also the Crowe side of the fence that was the line between 2 operations that had stopped being separate things in any way that counted. She stood beside him, and they looked out at the valley together. The land that ran north to his ridge and south to her lower pastures and east to the mountains that had tolerated them both for years and would tolerate them for years. The land that had asked everything from both of them and had given back everything it was capable of giving, which was enough. The valley was quiet. The fence between them stood straight and deep and properly anchored, and the ground on both sides of it was theirs. There are things that a person builds in a life that can be measured, fences and herds and ledger balances, and the specific accumulated record of what you did when things were difficult, And there are things that can't be measured, that have no line in the ledger, and no entry in any record, and no document that Fitch or Alderman or anyone else could file in a county office. What Eliza Whitmore and Nathan Crowe had built was both kinds. The measurable kind, which was real and hard-won and deserved every entry she'd ever made on its behalf, and the other kind, which was also real, which was harder won, and which had cost them each, in different ways and different seasons, the specific courage of admitting that the thing you'd stopped expecting was the thing you needed most. The valley kept its cold, clear light through the afternoon. They stood in it, both of them, for a long time.